For over 1,000 years, Rome wasn't just an empire. It was, for all intents and purposes, the entire world. It seemed absolutely eternal. So how does something that powerful, that massive, just vanish? In this explainer, we're going to get into the anatomy of that incredible collapse. I mean, for centuries, the Roman Empire wasn't just a superpower, it was the only superpower that mattered. It was a complete marvel of engineering, of law, of military strategy. From their roads to their aqueducts, everything they built was made to last forever. It really looked and felt permanent. But it wasn't. Here's the thing about the fall of Rome. It wasn't a single event. There was no one fatal blow. It's really the story of a slow, creeping sickness that rotted the whole thing from the inside out. Yeah, those spectacular invasions you always hear about, that was just the final act. To really, truly understand why Rome fell, we need to go back and diagnose the internal problems that had been festering for well over a century. Okay, so let's dive in. Our story really kicks off right here. For over 200 years, the empire had what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it was a golden age, a period of incredible stability. But as you can see on this timeline, that peace, it didn't last. It gave way to a really long, painful era of decline. So what was the first and maybe most critical symptom? Well, it was a total breakdown at the very top. The entire political system was starting to fail. In a way, Rome had become a victim of its own success. It was just too big for one person to govern effectively. The powerful emperors of the Pax Romana, they were replaced by a revolving door of weaker, often short-lived rulers. And what did that lead to? Constant civil war and chaos. For the average Roman citizen, any kind of confidence in the government, any sense of patriotism or loyalty, it just evaporated. Now, when the politics start to fall apart, what do you think happens to the economy? It began to crumble right along with it. And that created this really vicious cycle of decline. It was a perfect storm. The political chaos made trade routes super dangerous. At the exact same time, you had bad harvests, which meant food shortages. The government was desperate for cash, so they cranked up taxes. Then they started minting new coins with less silver in them, which meant your money was suddenly worth a whole lot less. That's called inflation, and it absolutely crushed the poor, creating this enormous, unbridgeable gap between the super rich and pretty much everyone else. And finally, the third piece of this tragic puzzle, the legendary Roman legions, the very backbone of the empire's power, began to break. Think about the irony here. Just as threats from outside tribes were getting stronger and stronger, Rome's military was being starved for cash. You had ambitious generals who were way more interested in fighting each other for the throne than they were in defending the borders. So, to cut costs, what did Rome do? It started hiring foreign soldiers, mercenaries, who had absolutely zero loyalty to the empire. They were just in it for the paycheck. The very shield of Rome was turning into one of its biggest weaknesses. So with the empire basically bleeding out on the table, two very powerful emperors stepped in to try what was essentially emergency surgery. Their reforms were, well, they were radical, and they would absolutely change the course of history. Meet our doctors, Diocletian and Constantine. In the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, these two guys looked at the situation and realized the empire was on life support. They knew that if they didn't do something drastic and fast, the whole thing was going to go under. Diocletian's diagnosis was actually pretty simple. The patient was just too big to manage. And his solution was one of the single most consequential decisions in all of world history. And this map shows you exactly what he did. Diocletian literally split the empire right down the middle. You now had a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. The idea was that each half would have its own ruler to manage things more closely. I mean, on paper, it's a pretty practical solution to a massive problem. But here's the catch. The two halves were not created equal. Not at all. The West was poorer, more rural, and facing all the immediate threats on the borders. The East, on the other hand, was way wealthier, more urban, that's where all the big trade hubs were. And take a wild guess which half Diocletian decided to rule for himself. Yep, the rich one, of course. So after Diocletian, the next major player is Emperor Constantine. Now, he briefly managed to reunite the empire, but his biggest, most lasting changes would only end up cementing that East-West divide forever. He made two game-changing moves.
First, he legalized Christianity, which completely reshaped the future of Western civilization. But his second move was just as critical for the empire's fate. He physically moved the capital city. He packed it up and moved it away from Rome all the way to a brand new city in the east, which he named, not so humbly, Constantinople. With that single decision, the empire's center of gravity shifted east for good.
And this brings us to the final act. The West was now politically hollowed out. It was economically a disaster, and its military was a mess. It was, basically, a sitting duck. The final blow didn't cause the fall. It just pushed over a building that was already rotten to its core. If we look back at our timeline, you can see we're in the end game now. All that internal decay we talked about, combined with all the power and wealth shifting over to the east, it just left the old Western Empire exposed and incredibly fragile. And this map, wow, it just perfectly visualizes the overwhelming pressure they were under. This wasn't a single army showing up at the gates. It was waves of different peoples. You had Goths, Vandals, Huns, all pushing into Roman territory from pretty much every direction. The weakened Roman army just couldn't hold them back. The end came shockingly fast. In 410, the city of Rome itself was sacked. I mean, can you imagine the psychological blow? For that to happen was just unthinkable. Then it happened again in 455. And finally, the nail in the coffin, 476 AD. The last Roman emperor in the West was kicked off his throne. And that was it. It was over. So, what was left in the rubble? Because the collapse of the West wasn't really just an ending. In a lot of ways, it was a profound, chaotic, and transformative beginning. In the West, the old empire basically shattered into a patchwork of different kingdoms. These would eventually become the nations that define the map of Europe today, setting the stage for the Middle Ages. But the East, remember the East? It was wealthier, more stable. It didn't fall. It survived and it thrived for another 1,000 years. We know it today as the Byzantine Empire. So in the end, the fall of Rome wasn't an event, it was a process. It was a slow decay of political trust, economic stability, and military readiness. And that leaves all of us with a really powerful question to think about. When we look at the symptoms that brought down Rome, are we just studying ancient history, or are we seeing a warning for our own time?